Milan slept under the rain. The streets reflected the glow of the streetlights, and the wind blew as if mourning something ancient. In the middle of the sidewalk, a woman wandered aimlessly, her dress clinging to her body, her face washed by tears and storm. No one stopped, no one noticed. The world seemed to have forgotten what compassion meant. But fate never forgets. It simply waits for the right moment to act. Then, a black car slowed to a stop. The sound of tires cutting through puddles broke the silence. The door opened, and out stepped a man with a steady gaze. The kind who doesn't fear the darkness because he's lived inside it. He didn't say a word. He just took off his jacket and placed it over the woman's shoulders. And in that single gesture, two lost souls recognized each other. The rain poured like a heavy curtain over the streets of Milan, washing away lights, voices, and even the sins the wind carried through the night. Helena walked without direction, her dress glued to her skin, the cold cutting through her like a blade. Her footsteps echoed through empty alleys, mixing with the distant sound of sirens. With every flash of lightning, her reflection appeared in the darkened shop windows, red eyes. A wounded soul, a heart trying to remember why it still beat. The world seemed to drift further away with each corner, and the city, indifferent, watched her fall apart in silence. She'd been fired that morning, not because of a mistake, but out of cruelty. A false scandal, a rumor born from jealousy, spreading fast like poison. And the man she loved, the one who swore to protect her, turned away when she needed him most. Now, between the rain and the asphalt, Helena was no longer a teacher or a fiancée, just a woman trying to stay on her feet in the middle of the storm. Cars passed like ghosts, indifferent to the pain dragging itself along the sidewalk. No one stopped. No one looked. Love and redemption felt like distant words to someone who could barely breathe. A thunderclap split the sky, and she flinched, clutching the thin coat that did nothing against the cold. Then came the sound of tires, a deep engine approaching slowly. A black car stopped in front of her. The door opened, and for a moment the whole world seemed to hold its breath. A man stepped out, tall, steady, every move measured, his eyes unreadable. His dark suit was soaked, but he didn't care. He took off his jacket and placed it over her shoulders, saying nothing. The warmth of the fabric made her shiver. The scent, a mix of rain, leather, and tobacco, gave her a strange sense of safety. She wanted to refuse, but the cold defeated her pride. When she finally looked up, she met his eyes. Calm, deep, the kind that carries more secrets than promises. For a moment, nothing existed but the rain. The man didn't ask questions, didn't offer smiles. He simply reached out his hand. "Get in the car," he said softly, unhurried, with the quiet authority of someone who never has to repeat himself. Helena hesitated, glancing down at the wet pavement, at the loneliness, at the cars passing by without seeing her. Then she looked at him. The choice came from instinct, or maybe fate. She got in. The leather seat was warm, and the hum of the engine sounded like a patient heartbeat. The windshield wipers marked time, and the silence between them felt almost sacred. No names were spoken, no explanations asked. Only the sound of rain, accompanying two strangers who, without realizing it, had just changed each other's destiny. The city passed by in blurs outside the window. Helena watched the reflections of the lights dance on the raindrops against the glass and thought about everything she had lost: her job, her love, her reputation, all swept away like leaves in a flood. And now, sitting beside a man who radiated power and mystery, she felt fear, but also something that dangerously resembled peace. He drove without looking at her, his expression neutral, yet his steady grip on the wheel revealed absolute control. Every movement seemed calculated, every silence intentional. And in that silence, Helena realized how much she longed for a place where she could simply exist, without needing to explain herself. The car stopped in front of an old hotel with an elegant facade. Staff members hurried to open the door. The man stepped out first, adjusted the jacket still resting on her shoulders, and extended his hand again. took it hesitantly, but didn't let go. Inside, the warm air wrapped around her like an unexpected embrace. The lobby glowed under the golden light of chandeliers. Security guards gave subtle nods, and the receptionists straightened their posture the moment they saw him. That's when Helena understood this wasn't an ordinary man. He carried weight, the kind of power that makes the world around fall silent. He asked for a room, his voice firm, not glancing at his watch, not looking at anyone. She followed him, confused and almost ashamed, feeling like she was stepping into a world where she didn't belong. Yet something about that stranger kept her from turning back. A quiet magnetism, an invisible gravity. The elevator climbed in silence, their reflections in the mirror resembling an old painting. The lost woman and the man fate had sent at the wrong time. Helena tried to speak, but he just shook his head, asking for silence. The sound of rain against the elevator windows was almost a mournful song. The room was wide, wrapped in half-darkness. He turned on a single soft light, as if protecting the moment from too much brightness. "You're safe here," he said, in the same calm tone as before. She nodded, unable to respond. The word safe felt strange on her lips. It had been so long since she'd felt that way. He watched her for a moment, then turned toward the window. The city outside gleamed like an open wound. "Sometimes," he said quietly, almost to himself, "rain washes away more than just footprints." She didn't understand what he meant, but she stored the phrase as if keeping a secret. When he said goodbye and closed the door, the silence in the room seemed to scream. Helena stood still for a long moment, breathing in the scent of his jacket and the weight of the night on her shoulders. She took it off carefully and folded it, placing it over the armchair. The fabric still felt warm, as if his touch refused to fade. Sitting at the edge of the bed, she looked toward the window and saw the reflection of her own loneliness. Outside, the storm went on, and somehow she knew that man would cross her path again. Fate has strange ways of weaving forbidden loves and broken hearts together. When she turned off the light, the rain didn't stop. It only changed tone, softer, steadier. And in the rhythm of that hypnotic sound, Helena fell asleep with a light heart for the first time in a long while. The jacket on the armchair was the only trace of the stranger, a silent sign that her story had only just begun. Dawn arrived shyly, filtering through the heavy hotel curtains. The rain had stopped, yet its echo lingered in Helena's mind like a living memory. The room smelled of fresh coffee and expensive cologne, the same faint scent she remembered from the jacket folded over the armchair. She sat on the edge of the bed, trying to make sense of what had happened. It felt as if a storm had torn away everything she once knew, leaving behind only that moment, suspended somewhere between fear and gratitude. Her heart beat slowly, carrying the strange feeling that something greater had just begun. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the reflection. Her damp hair fell over her shoulders, and her eyes, once tired, now held an unsettling brightness, a kind of hope she hadn't given permission to exist. She got dressed slowly, trying to recover her composure, like someone waking from a dream they refused to admit they had. When she opened the door, the hallway was empty, but an envelope lay on the floor. Inside, a single handwritten line: "Breakfast is downstairs." No name, no mark, just the steady handwriting of someone who didn't need a signature to be recognized. She descended the stairs with slow, careful steps, the sound of her heels blending with the soft music playing in the lounge. The scent of toasted bread and the low murmur of voices filled the air. And then she saw him. Sitting by the window, with sunlight slipping through the blinds, Marco Bellini looked like he was made of contrast, equal parts shadow and light. The dark suit, the discreet gold watch, the calm gaze of a man who seems to command time itself. When he looked up and saw her approaching, a faint smile touched his lips, brief, restrained, as if it didn't want to be noticed. Helena felt her stomach tighten. What she felt wasn't just gratitude. It was heavier and far more dangerous. She tried to speak first, but her voice failed. He gestured lightly for her to sit. "Coffee?" he asked, the words sounding different in his voice, almost like an offer of peace. Helena nodded. The waiter approached and served 2 cups with quiet precision, as if performing a ritual. For a few seconds, the clinking of porcelain was the only sound between them. Then he spoke, without looking directly at her. "You were crying in the rain. Why?" The question was simple, yet it struck deep, cutting where it still hurt. Helena took a breath, fighting the flood of memories, and then she told him. She told him about her fiancé, the scandal, the firing, about the rumor planted with cruel precision, and the cowardice of the man who abandoned her when the world turned its back. As she spoke, Marco remained silent, fingers intertwined, eyes fixed on the steam rising from his cup. When she finished, he said nothing. He simply moved his cup slightly, as if weighing the shape of destiny in his hands. The silence that followed felt almost physical, like an invisible wall between them. And yet, something had shifted. Not pity, but understanding. As if he, in some way, knew the taste of loss. Helena stood to thank him and leave, but then she noticed a small box on the table. "What's this?" she asked quietly. He replied simply, "A place to start again." Inside, a golden key rested on velvet. No address. No explanation. Just a silent promise of shelter. Helena froze, unsure what the gesture meant. A gift? A debt? A trap? Marco rose, slipped on his jacket, and adjusted the cuffs of his shirt. "As sometimes, when the world destroys everything," he said. His voice calm but distant, it takes someone to rebuild in silence. Then he walked away, the sound of his shoes echoing across the marble floor. Helena sat alone at the table, the key in her hand and her heart burning. Through the window she caught a glimpse of him crossing the street, his reflection fading into the blur of cars and shadows. She didn't know his name, but somehow that seemed less important than the emptiness his absence left behind. Something deep inside told her this man wasn't a savior, he was an enigma. A danger dressed in calm, an abyss that invited her closer. And still, she wanted to follow him. Because, for the first time in a long while, someone had looked at her and seen something beyond the wreckage. Back in her room, she placed the key on the table and sat in front of it, staring at the small piece of metal as if it were a mirror. So many questions. No answers. The rain had stopped, but droplets still fell from the rooftops, slow and rhythmic. It felt as though the world itself was breathing in time with her uncertainty. Without realizing it, Helena began to smile, a faint, fleeting curve of her lips, born somewhere between fear and curiosity. Something was stirring inside her, something that tasted both bitter and sweet, like a dangerous love about to begin. The hotel cafe was far too elegant for someone like her. The chandeliers hung like suspended jewels, and every table carried the quiet poise of people born into comfort. Sitting by the window, Helena felt like an intruder in a play where no one missed a line. Cups clinked softly, whispers were refined, and glances, sharp as knives, flickered with curiosity. Everything about her felt out of place. The simple dress, the restless eyes, the disordered soul. Marco was there, just a few tables away. The man with the jacket. The same man who had stopped the rain with a single gesture and altered the course of her night. He was talking to other men, all in suits, all too tense to be ordinary. When he spoke, voices went silent. When he looked, everyone straightened. Marco didn't demand respect, he inspired it. Power seemed to shape the air around him, slowing the world to his pace. Helena watched him quietly, trying to decipher the man no one dared to touch. He didn't seem cruel, but there was something dangerous about his composure, as if every breath he took was a calculated decision. And yet there was gentleness too in the way he held his cup, in the restrained way he spoke. He was a mystery of contrasts, steel and shelter, cold and fire. A man caught somewhere between redemption and guilt. He noticed her gaze, and for a brief moment, time hesitated. Marco's eyes met hers, and Helena felt as if someone had opened a window inside her chest. Her heart raced, and she quickly looked away, embarrassed. When she finally raised her head again, he was already walking toward her. Each step echoed like a heartbeat against the marble floor. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. "Feeling better?" he asked softly, his voice low, almost a whisper. Helena only nodded. The sound of his voice was deep, calm, yet carrying something hidden beneath it. An old wound, perhaps. He motioned for her to sit at his table. The waiter appeared instantly, as if the gesture had been rehearsed. 2 cups, steam, and silence. Marco didn't look at her while stirring his coffee, and yet she felt as if she were being read, line by line, without a single word spoken. "Why were you crying that night?" he asked suddenly. The question fell like a stone into a still lake. Helena took a deep breath, the words trembling on her lips. She told him about the fiancé who betrayed her, the scandal that had been fabricated, the cruel dismissal. She spoke of shame, loneliness, and the wish to disappear. Marco listened in silence. He didn't show pity or surprise. He just listened, with the understanding of someone who knows what it's like to lose everything and still remain standing. When she finished, he set his spoon down on the saucer with quiet precision. "The world is cruel to those who still believe," he said, his gaze drifting toward the window, where the rain had started again. There was something in his tone that made her shiver, a restrained melancholy, almost like an apology to the universe. Helena realized that this man also knew the taste of pain, and that realization was what held her there, without knowing why. Before she could say anything, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a small black box on the table. No explanation. Helena looked at it wearily, then opened it. Inside was a golden key and a note. "A safe place. Use it if you wish." She looked up, confused. "Why?" she asked. Marco lifted his eyes slowly and replied, "Because everyone deserves a new beginning, even those who no longer believe in one." The gesture disarmed her. No one had ever offered her something without asking for anything in return. Marco stood, adjusted his jacket, and prepared to leave. "If you decide to use it, go at dusk," he said. "It's safer then." She wanted to thank him, but no words came out. When he walked through the door, the air itself seemed to change in weight. Helena was left alone, the key in her hands, her heart split between fear and curiosity. The man with the jacket had left her more than shelter. He had left her a riddle. The city felt different that night. The streets were wet, the signs reflected the fine drizzle, and the sound of her footsteps echoed like a promise. Helena followed the address written on the note, not knowing what she would find. The building was old, surrounded by tall trees that hid its windows from the world. The doorman greeted her with a look that mixed respect and secrecy. No questions, no surprise. It was as if they had been expecting her. The apartment smelled of wood, books, and silence. Heavy curtains filtered the light into amber tones. On the table lay a short note. "Nothing in this place is by chance." Helena sat on the couch and looked around. Everything seemed untouched, yet strangely familiar, as if someone had prepared that refuge for a woman who didn't yet know how much she needed it. And for the first time in a long time, she cried in peace. In the days that followed, the apartment became an invisible haven. Helena woke without hurry, read, drank coffee, and let time drift without guilt. Sometimes flowers appeared at the door, always white, always accompanied by silence. Other times she noticed a black car parked on the corner, unmoving. She knew who was there, but pretended not to. The feeling of being watched no longer frightened her. It had become comforting. One afternoon she decided to return to the hotel. She needed answers. She needed to hear his name from someone else's lips. In the lobby, eyes followed her once again. "Bellini," said the receptionist when she asked. The name fell heavy in the air. Marco Bellini. Now she knew. The name that ruled over Deal's debts. and destinies in Milan. The man who commanded with a gesture, who solved everything through silence. And the same man who had once shielded her from the rain. Back at the apartment, Helena spent hours staring at her reflection in the window. She didn't know whether to feel grateful or afraid. Marco Bellini, a name that inspired fear, yet the man she had met felt different. Which one was real, the protector or the criminal? The question burned in her chest, and within that uncertainty, something dangerous began to grow. A forbidden affection, born from curiosity and sustained by mystery. The phone rang close to midnight, shattering the stillness of the room. She answered with trembling hands. "Don't go out alone at night," said the deep voice on the other end. It was him. The line went dead before she could reply. Helena stood frozen, heart pounding, wondering whether it was a warning or a gesture of care. The line between love and control was becoming dangerously thin. In the days that followed, everything grew more intense. The black car began to appear more often. Sometimes she saw him from the balcony, smoking under the fog. Other times she simply felt his presence, as if he were nearby, unseen. Marco never texted, never called again. He only left traces, flowers, notes, silence, a form of presence that never asked permission. And somehow, she didn't want it to stop. One morning, Helena found another note beneath her door. "Not all angels have wings. Some just carry the weight of what they've done." She read it more than once, unsure whether it was a confession or a metaphor. She tucked the paper into a drawer and realized her heart was racing. What began as gratitude had turned into something uncontrollable. She knew what it meant to want what you shouldn't, and still, she couldn't stop. Loneliness began to blur into anticipation. Every sound in the hallway, every flicker of shadow on the glass felt like a sign he might appear. Fear tangled with desire. And the more she tried to push him from her mind, the deeper he settled in her thoughts. Marco Bellini was not the kind of man one meets. He was the kind one survives. And Helena, without realizing it, was already inside his world. A world where love and danger walked side by side. It was 2 a.m. when the phone rang again. The same voice. The same calm tone. "Sleep, Helena." Then the call ended. She pressed the phone against her chest, closed her eyes, and smiled. She didn't know if she was laughing at the irony or at her own madness. But one thing she knew for certain. She would never be the same again. Something within her had already surrendered to the man she was supposed to fear. Outside, the rain returned. Gentle, whispering secrets to the city below. The world slept, unaware. Inside, Helena looked at the jacket draped over the chair, a living memory of that night. She ran her fingers over the fabric and felt the same warmth as before. Deep down, she finally understood what it meant. She didn't belong to his world. And yet, somehow, that world now belonged to her. The following days passed slowly, wrapped in a silence that seemed to be watching her. Helena lived caught between relief and unease, feeling that the apartment was more than a refuge. It was a gilded cage. The flowers kept arriving, always white, always anonymous. And even without a name, she already knew the one hiding behind each petal. Marco Bellini was a presence that didn't need to be near to be felt. One night, while leafing through an old book on the small shelf, she heard a knock on the door. Her heart skipped. For a moment, she thought of not answering. But curiosity outweighed fear. She opened it and found herself face to face with a large man in a black suit, his expression hard and unreadable. "Mr. Bellini asked that you accept this," he said simply, handing her an envelope before walking away without another word. The sound of his footsteps fading down the hall felt heavier than the night itself. Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter, firm, elegant handwriting, unsigned. "Not everything dangerous is evil. Some people protect from afar, because if they get too close, they destroy what they're trying to save." Helena read it over and over, unsure if it was a warning or a confession. Her chest tightened, Something told her he was apologizing for something that hadn't yet happened. The next morning, she went to the market. She needed to feel the real world again, the smell of fresh bread, the sound of ordinary voices, the simple chaos of the streets. But as she stepped out of the building, she saw it, the black car at the corner, the same one as always. The driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror, but didn't move. She sighed, pretended not to notice, and kept walking. Still, the weight of that gaze followed her to the last corner. It was like being watched by a ghost who chose to stay. When she returned, the apartment looked exactly as she'd left it, almost. On the table sat a glass of wine and a short message written on a napkin. "Don't trust anyone who smiles too easily." She froze, scanning the room. Someone had been there. But how? The doorman hadn't mentioned any visitors. The windows were locked. A chill spread through her entire body. For the first time, she was afraid that the mystery she'd been living might become a prison. Determined to find answers, Helena went back to the hotel where they had met. She insisted until one of the security guards agreed to speak to her. A grey-haired man with a tired look and a smoker's voice. When he heard her name, his face changed. "If Mr. Bellini gave you shelter, then trust him," he said. "But don't ask why." Helena pressed him further. He hesitated, glanced around, then whispered, "He is who he is. The head of the Bellini family. The man who keeps this city in order, through fear." The words came heavy, like stones. Helena took a step back, the air leaving her lungs. The stories she'd heard in whispers and newspapers came flooding back. Extortions, disappearances, illicit deals. Everything she had wanted to forget about the darker side of the world was now knocking on her door. And amid that revelation, a single question gnawed at her. Why would a man like that care about someone like her? None of it made sense. None of his actions fit the stories. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her mind kept returning to that first rain, to the jacket over her shoulders, to the calm voice that had said, "You're safe here." It had all felt real. It had all felt human. And now, the name Bellini turned it into a contradiction. Was the protector also the predator? Or was there something she still didn't understand? The question swung like a pendulum between faith and fear. The phone rang in the middle of the night. The sound cut through the silence like a blade. "Why are you looking for what you shouldn't?" His voice was calm, yet sharp enough to wound. Helena froze, the receiver trembling in her hand. "Because I want to know who you are," she said, her voice barely a whisper. There was a pause, a silence that felt alive, breathing between them. Then came his answer, low and steady. "I'm someone who tried to escape hell. And couldn't. Now I try to keep others from entering it." The line went dead. The final click echoed through the room like a verdict that could not be appealed. Morning arrived heavy and colourless. Helena unfolded the newspaper without thinking, and the world stopped. Businessman found dead in his penthouse, suspected family revenge. The name printed below struck her like a blow to the chest. Enzo Rinaldi, her former fiancé, the man who had ruined her life. The same one whose betrayal had left her in the rain that night. Her hands trembled over the paper, eyes scanning the words as if they might rearrange themselves. The article mentioned old connections between Rinaldi and the Bellini family. Connections. Or protection. A chill ran down her spine. She didn't need confirmation. Marco knew. He had always known. Everything began to make sense, but in a way that hurt to breathe. The help, the silence, the key. None of it had been chance. He had found her not by fate, but by purpose. He knew who she was, what she'd lost, and who had destroyed her. Maybe it was guilt, maybe justice. But beneath it all there was something else, something he couldn't control. And now she was part of it, part of him, part of a world where salvation and sin were two sides of the same coin. That night, the city glowed like an open wound beneath the storm. Helena stood on the balcony, feeling the wind cut across her face. Somewhere out there, in the dark veins of Milan, he was watching. She could sense it, that quiet pull, the invisible thread that tied them together. She wanted to hate him. She told herself she should. But every time she closed her eyes, she heard his voice, that calm tone that somehow made her feel safe. Was it love? Fascination? Or the lonely heart mistaking danger for warmth? She didn't know. All she knew was that she no longer wanted to run. Days bled into nights. The flowers kept coming, the car appeared and disappeared, and every shadow in the hallway began to look like him. Each silence became a message. Each glimpse of the black car felt like a heartbeat waiting for hers. Sometimes it vanished for days and she'd feel its absence like a wound. Other times she'd catch a glimpse of him, a silhouette, a reflection, the glow of a cigarette, and her chest would tighten. The mystery had become her oxygen, and she knew she was lost. One morning the doorman called her downstairs. A familiar figure waited, the same man in the black suit, his expression carved from stone. "He asked me to return this," he said simply. In his hands was the jacket, the one from that night. She took it slowly, her breath catching as she felt the weight of it. Inside the pocket, a note was folded neatly. "Kindness doesn't erase blood, but sometimes love tries." She pressed the jacket to her chest, inhaling the faint scent of tobacco and rain. That single breath told her everything. He was trying to stay away, and that hurt more than any betrayal ever could. That night, sleep refused to come. The jacket hung over the chair, haunting her like a memory that refused to fade. His scent lingered in the air, warm and cold all at once. The rain began to fall again, soft, rhythmic, familiar. Helena rose, walked to the window, and looked down at the street. The black car was there, parked beneath the same streetlight, as if it had never left. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the headlights blinked once, slow and deliberate, a silent farewell. She didn't cry. She didn't wave. She simply stood there, heart pounding, understanding what words could never say. He was still there, still protecting her. But some loves, she realized, are destined to exist only in the distance between two people who were never meant to meet. Dawn arrived with a sweet kind of sadness. Helena made coffee, opened the curtains, and let the light spill into the room. The golden key was still on the table, not a symbol of possession, but of promise. Outside, the city was waking, unaware that inside her, the world was beginning again. Marco Bellellini was danger. He was sin. But he was also the man who stopped the rain just to cover her shoulders. And that alone had forever bound her to his mystery. In the days that followed, she decided to return to teaching private lessons. She needed to fill her hours, her mind, her heart. Still, every deep voice on the street made her tremble. Every black car that passed made her chest tighten. The past and the present now lived in the same shadow, and without realizing it. She had begun walking between two worlds, the one where innocence was lost, and the one where guilt learned to love. The mystery of her protector grew like a story written between the lines. No one knew what tied them together. Perhaps not even they did. They only knew something unseen connected them, something neither fear nor reason could sever. Marco was the sin she would never have chosen, but also the salvation she never expected. And as the city continued to breathe, destiny was quietly waiting for the moment to bring the sky and the storm together once more. Night fell over Milan with the weight of memory. The wind carried the faint scent of rain, and the distant bells of the cathedral mixed with the hum of traffic. Helena climbed the hill slowly, her heart torn between courage and recklessness. The golden key rested in her pocket, but this time she wasn't seeking refuge. She was seeking truth. She wanted to look into the eyes of the man who had saved her and finally understand who he really was. The Bellini mansion rose before her, silent and imposing, with tall windows and iron gates shaped like lacework. The old facade seemed to watch those who dared to come closer. Two guards saw her cross the gate but didn't stop her. They only exchanged a glance, a look of surprise as if they'd seen a ghost. Helena felt the weight of the walls around her. It was like stepping into the heart of danger, yet the fear was smaller than the longing. The grand hall glowed under golden chandeliers that threw warm reflections on the marble floor. The air smelled of wood, wine, and power. Every step echoed softly, as if awakening old secrets. A man in a dark suit guided her forward without asking her name. They climbed a wide staircase, the carpet beneath their feet muffling the sound. At the end of the corridor, a smoked glass door reflected her hesitation. Behind it, he was waiting. Marco Bellini stood by the fireplace, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his gaze lost in the flames. He looked tired, human, fragile, nothing like the man the world feared. When he heard her footsteps, he turned slowly. The silence that followed was more powerful than any words could be. For an instant, they looked like two survivors from the same storm, standing together in the eye of it. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed him. There was fear there, not of her, but of what she represented. Helena drew a breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to understand." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion etched into his movements. "Understand what?" "That the man who helped you is the same one who gives the order to kill." The words cut through the air like a blade, but she didn't flinch. She met his gaze and said softly, "I want to understand the man who looked at me in the rain." The fire crackled softly, throwing warm light across their faces. Marco stepped closer, and the faint scent of his cologne pulled every buried memory back to the surface. "You think you know what you saw that night?" he asked quietly. Helena held his gaze. "I know what I felt." He looked away, breathing deeply, as if wrestling something invisible inside him. "I'm not a good man, Helena." She took a step forward. "But you were a man when no one else was." The words hit him like a silent blow. Marco lowered his head, a bitter half-smile flickering at the corner of his mouth. "You don't understand the price I pay." Helena moved closer still. "Then teach me." For a moment he seemed to lose command of the role he'd built for himself. The hardness in his expression cracked, revealing something raw, the quiet confession of a man carrying more guilt than wounds. Time between them split in two. "There are things you shouldn't hear," he murmured. "And things you've already said without realizing." Helena reached out, her fingers brushing his jacket. The gesture was small, but it threw the air off balance. Marco closed his eyes, breathing in her touch like someone reliving a memory that hurts too much to let go. "You don't know what you're doing," he whispered. "Maybe I do," she replied softly. "Maybe it's the only thing I still know how to do. Stay." The clock on the wall marked each second like a sentence. Marco stepped back, trying to gather himself. "I don't want you to get hurt." Helena gave a sad smile. "I already am, Marco. I just don't want it to be for nothing." He looked at her, and that look said more than any vow could. There was danger in it, the kind of love that's born where reason dies. And even without speaking, they both knew it was already too late. He walked to the window, his silhouette framed by the city lights beyond. "Do you know what it's like to be feared but never loved?" His voice was rough, almost breaking. "Do you know what it's like to save one person and destroy 10 to make it happen?" Helena stayed silent. The quiet between them was its own answer. Marco turned, eyes darkened by confession. "I tried not to go back there. Tried to forget you. But every time it rains, I remember." Her name lingered on his lips like a wound reopening. Helena felt her heart break, and then, somehow, be reborn. She crossed the room until she stood close enough to feel his breath. "Maybe you forgot something, Marco," she whispered. "Sometimes love is just another kind of war." He let out a low, humorless laugh. "And you think you can win a war against the Mafia with your heart?" Helena lifted her chin, eyes steady. "No, but I can win you." The spark between them ignited, and what followed was silence. Thick, magnetic, inevitable. Marco took a step forward, his shadow falling across her face. The air between them grew heavy, charged like metal before lightning strikes. For one heartbeat, everything, guilt, fear, desire, seemed suspended in the space between their breaths. He raised his hand, almost touching her cheek, but stopped at the last moment. "If I touch you, I won't be able to stop," Helena whispered. "Then don't." But he pulled back. His self-control was the last wall he had left. "Should go," he said, turning away. "And you should stop pretending you're beyond redemption," she answered. He looked at her then, surprised by the quiet fire in her voice. "You don't know what you're saying." Helena smiled faintly. "Yes, I do. I saw kindness in the eyes of a man the world calls a monster." The flames danced in her eyes. And in that reflection Marco saw something he hadn't seen in years. Faith. The silence was broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Marco turned, picked up a leather folder from the table, and spoke with the same calm authority that always masked something deeper. "Work with me," he said suddenly. Helena frowned, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "I need someone I can trust in the family library. You know, books? I need someone who can read what I don't have time to read." She studied him, unsure whether it was an order or a plea. "Why me?" His answer came without hesitation. "Because you're the only person in this house who doesn't owe me anything." The words hung in the air like smoke. For the first time, Helena saw something fragile beneath his composure. A man asking for help without admitting it. Marco Bellolini didn't ask for things, he commanded. And yet, this was different. It was a fracture, small but human. She nodded slowly. "I'll do it," he exhaled, the weight in his chest settling. "Start tomorrow," he said, reclaiming his mask of control. "And remember, nothing inside these walls is what it seems." The warning lingered between them, sounding more like a promise than a threat. When Helena stepped out of the room, she glanced back. Marco was still standing before the fire, motionless, a statue carved from regret and pride. For a heartbeat she wanted to return, to say something, to stay. But she understood that what existed between them had to grow in silence first. The hallway seemed longer now. Each step she took was a quiet vow to uncover the truth buried beneath that man and the guilt that haunted him. Outside, the rain had started again. The air smelled of wet earth, laced with the faint trace of his scent still clinging to her hands. Helena looked up at the sky and smiled. Fate had reopened a door, and crossing it meant she would never walk out the same. Their reunion had not brought answers, only a spark that even fear could not extinguish. The fire, both inside and outside the mansion, kept burning. The corridors of the Bellini mansion were long and shadowed, lined with old tapestries that seemed to watch her pass. Her footsteps echoed softly, as if the house itself whispered its secrets. The library waited at the top floor, behind a pair of heavy wooden doors. When she entered, the air smelled of aged paper, leather, and time. It was a temple hidden inside the dark. Bookshelves stretched to the ceiling, filled with volumes bound in gold and written in languages she barely recognized. Light filtered through a frosted skylight above, washing everything in a golden, reverent glow. Helena ran her fingers along the spines, feeling the dust of years. It was like touching the Bellini family's soul, a lineage built on power, loss, and redemption. Somewhere in those pages, she knew his name was written. For the first few days she worked quietly, cataloguing, dusting, restoring order. Marco rarely appeared, but she could always tell when he was near. The air itself changed. His footsteps were unmistakable, steady, measured, like the pulse of the house. Sometimes he stopped at the doorway, watching in silence. Other times he left a cup of coffee on her desk and left without a word. Small gestures, but heavy with meaning. One morning, while rearranging a shelf, Helena noticed a drawer hidden beneath the desk. It was locked, old, the keyhole lined with rust. With gentle pressure, it gave way. Inside lay an ancient journal embossed with the Bellini crest. The lock was fragile, and it snapped easily beneath her fingers. She hesitated for a moment, then opened it. The first pages spoke of alliances, debts, and losses, pacts sealed with loyalty and blood. But the final line froze her breath. Kindness is a burden no dangerous man can carry without breaking. Helena stared at the words until they blurred. She closed the book slowly, her reflection trembling in the gilded edge of the page. Somewhere in the house below, she could feel Marco's presence, restless, like a soul pacing its own cage. And in that moment, she finally understood. The fire she'd seen in him wasn't power, it was punishment. When Marco appeared, she was still holding the journal. He stopped in the doorway, his gaze locked on the book. "Where did you find that?" His voice was calm, but it carried the precision of a blade. Helena tried to answer, but the words failed her. He walked closer, slow and deliberate, and took the diary from her hands, closing it sharply. "Some stories are meant to stay locked away, Helena." The way he said her name was different, softer, almost tender, but every syllable carried pain. After that, the silence between them thickened. Marco began visiting the library more often, yet spoke little. Sometimes he sat in the armchair by the fire, watching the flames flicker as if trying to remember something they had burned away. Other times, he read aloud from ancient books, his voice low and steady, as though confessing secrets to the air itself. Helena listened, and with each word, a hidden piece of him unfolded. It was like reading a soul written in code. One winter afternoon, she found him asleep in the armchair. The faint glow of dusk softened his face, erasing the edges of the man the city feared. The hardness dissolved, leaving only weariness, the kind born from years of carrying a name too heavy. Helena approached without thinking, and gently adjusted the jacket slipping from his shoulder. Marco opened his eyes slowly. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. They shared the same air, the same stillness, as if time itself had paused to watch. "You don't have to take care of me," he murmured, voice still thick with sleep. Helena smiled faintly. "Someone has to." He looked away, uneasy. "I used to know someone who said that." She wanted to ask who, but his silence answered before she could. There was grief in his expression, guilt and tenderness entwined. That man had loved once, and lost. And now, every gesture he made was a quiet, failing attempt at forgiveness. The nights that followed felt different. Helena continued her work, but now she did it under the constant presence of Marco. He seemed anchored to her, as if her calmness kept him from sinking. Often, they said nothing at all. They simply shared the same silence, the same air. It was a companionship woven from pauses and glances, fragile and wordless. And somewhere between those silences, love began to grow, slow, forbidden, inevitable. One night she asked softly, "Why did you choose me for this?" Marco looked up from the book, his eyes steady. "Because you're the kind of person who still believes in goodness, even after being betrayed by it." The words hung between them like shards of a broken mirror. Helena felt her throat tighten. "And is that good or bad?" Marco closed the book gently and whispered, "It's dangerous." Time began to lose shape after that. The days blurred into one another. The nights stretched endlessly. Helena noticed the subtle changes, the way his eyes lingered a little longer, the way her name left his lips with a gentler weight. Marco didn't need to say what he felt. It lived in every pause, every quiet breath between them. It was a love written in silence, restrained, inevitable, and already too deep to undo. One afternoon, while searching through a forgotten shelf, Helena found a framed photograph. A young woman stared back, calm eyes, a sad smile. On the back, an inscription, "For Marco," because even love gets tired of waiting. The handwriting was familiar. It was the same as the letter he had once sent her. She held the photo in silence, unsure if keeping it was right. But from that moment on, she began to understand the weight he carried. Marco appeared a few minutes later, and something in her eyes gave her away. "What did you find this time?" he asked, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I found out that you speak a lot, through other people." He didn't answer. He simply stepped closer, the air between them charged with unspoken truths. For a moment, Helena thought he might finally break the silence that always lived between them. But instead, he just breathed deeply and said, "Keep working." As the days passed, their relationship became an invisible pact. He trusted her without saying it, and she understood him without needing to. Between them there was a fragile balance, redemption and danger. Forgiveness and guilt, all coexisting in the same breath. The more Helena saw of him, the more she recognized the man behind the myth. Marco Bellini was not just power, he was pain. And maybe that was what made him human. On a cold night, the wind howled outside while the fire flickered in shades of orange and gold. Helena read aloud from an old book she'd found on the shelf. Marco watched her silently, his expression softer than usual. Her voice filled the room, smooth and quiet, and something in the air shifted. Broken souls always recognize each other, even without words, she read. Marco closed his eyes, and a faint smile crossed his lips. "Maybe that's why you appeared in my storm." Helena's breath caught. The way he said my storm felt more intimate than any touch. In that instant she realized their love had already begun, quietly, dangerously, without either of them admitting it. Marco lifted his gaze, and the firelight danced in his eyes. "Be careful, Helena," he murmured. "Some love stories end before they ever begin." She smiled faintly and replied, "But the ones that start in the rain never end the same." The clock struck the hour, its echo filling the room. Marco stood, walked to the window, and stared out into the dark garden. "You need to trust me," he said quietly, "even when everything feels wrong." Helena nodded, unsure what he meant. "Why?" "Because some truths can only be told once the danger has passed." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed something deeper. Fear, not of the world, of her. In the days that followed, the air in the mansion changed. Men came and went. Meetings happened behind closed doors. Helena caught fragments of whispered conversations, debts, loyalties, betrayals. She began to see the mansion for what it was, not a palace, but a battlefield, and Marco, its weary general. Now she understood why he said love was dangerous, because love made him vulnerable. Late one night, hurried footsteps echoed through the hall. Marco appeared, tense, his eyes dark with warning. "Don't trust anyone in this house," he said in a low voice. "Not even me." Helena froze, her mind spinning. Before she could speak, he was gone, a shadow swallowed by the silence. She stood alone between the bookshelves, heart racing, realizing at last that the secrets surrounding her were far greater than she could have imagined. She returned to work, but the silence of the library no longer felt like silence. It was the sound of something hiding, of a threat breathing beneath the stillness. Surrounded by books about kingdoms and wars, Helena realized she was living her own story of power and betrayal. Only this time, the battlefield was her heart. And at its center stood Marco Bellini, the man who taught her that even danger can speak with the voice of shelter. Days inside the Bellini mansion began to lose their rhythm. The once muffled voices now echoed through the halls in low, urgent tones. The house seemed to pulse with unease, as if waiting for something inevitable to unfold. Marco avoided her gaze. He moved quickly, his expression tense, his posture heavy with the weight of news he couldn't yet share. Helena sensed it. Something was moving in the shadows, something even power couldn't contain. One morning, while organizing old records in the library, Helena found a forgotten folder buried beneath ledgers. Inside, photographs, contracts, and names she didn't recognize, until one stopped her breath. Enzo Rinaldi, the man who had destroyed her life, the one who spread the lies that ruined her. Her skin turned cold. At the bottom of the file, stamped in black ink, was the Bellini family crest, and scribbled in another hand, at the edge of the page, one name, Marco. Her hands trembled. The pages burned between her fingers. Marco had signed agreements with Enzo years ago, investments, partnerships, financial deals. In that instant, everything made sense. His silence, his protection. How he knew so much about her past. The truth was not kindness, it was guilt. Helena slammed the dossier shut, nausea twisting in her stomach. The truth tasted like metal and regret. That night she waited for him. The fire died down, the rain began to fall, and the clock marked the slow unraveling of patience. When Marco finally entered, his eyes were too tired to lie. "You knew who I was from the start," she said. He froze. "Helena," but she cut him off. "You knew? You knew the man who ruined my life, and you still brought me into yours." Her voice cracked through the air like thunder. Marco closed the door quietly and leaned against it. For once he didn't look like the head of the Bellini empire, he looked like a man cornered by his own guilt. "I did know," he admitted, "and I tried to stay away. But when I saw you in the rain, I couldn't." Helena let out a bitter laugh. "So what was all this then? A confession? A penance?" He didn't answer. His silence was surrender. The air between them felt charged, alive with anger and ache. Helena took a step closer. "You killed him, didn't you?" Marco's eyes met hers, dark, unwavering. "He didn't deny it. He deserved to pay for what he did to you." Her breath caught. "And you decided to be the judge?" He clenched his fists, his voice turning to iron. "I decided to be what I've always been. The man who does what others are too afraid to do." Helena stood still, torn between horror and compassion. This man was capable of killing, but he was also the only one who had ever truly protected her. That contradiction cut through her like a blade. She wanted to hate him, but something inside her refused. The memory of the jacket on her shoulders still lingered, a quiet proof that even sin doesn't erase kindness entirely. Her voice broke the silence, fragile and trembling. "I don't know if I'm afraid of you, or for you." Marco drew in a long breath, trying to contain what was already breaking inside him. "I don't want your forgiveness, Helena. I just want you to live, to breathe again without looking back." She crossed her arms, fighting the tremor in her voice. "And you think you can control that too? What I feel?" He stepped closer, slow, deliberate. "If I could, Helena, I would have already ripped myself out of you." The words struck the air like glass, shattering, raw, bleeding. They stayed there, suspended between them, two open wounds that refused to close. The next days were silent. Elena went back to her work, but the rustle of pages had become a sound without meaning. Marco disappeared for 2 days. Without him, the mansion felt altered, colder, hostile, haunted by the absence of its own master. The staff avoided eye contact. The corridors smelled faintly of fear. When he finally returned, his face was bruised, his suit wrinkled, his eyes darker than ever. "They know about you," he said quietly, "and they'll try to use you against me." Helena's stomach dropped. "Who are they?" "The men I once called brothers." He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the tremor in his hand betraying the weight of the truth. "You think it's easy to take a woman out of a man's life? A man like me?" Helena looked at him, her voice steady, though her heart was not. "You could have left me out of this." He gave a bitter laugh, one that sounded more like surrender. "Not after that night. Not after the rain." The words came out like a confession and a farewell. That night Helena couldn't sleep. The sound of the storm returned, tangled with the memory of his voice, his touch, his impossible warmth. Deep down she knew the past wasn't coming back to haunt them, it was coming to collect its due. Their love had been a sentence written long before it began, and though she tried to deny it, she no longer wanted to escape. She was a prisoner of her own choice. By morning the rain had calmed, but her heart hadn't. When she entered the library, the old journal was waiting on the desk. Open. A new line written in fresh ink. Guilt is the price of redemption. And love is the price of guilt. Her chest tightened. Marco had written it. He'd left it there, as a message, or maybe as a warning. But Helena had never been one to surrender easily. She closed the journal firmly and stood, her resolve hardening. Something had to be done. At the main gate, 2 guards blocked her way. "Mr. Bellini's orders," one said. "You can't leave." Helena met their eyes calmly. "Then tell him I'm no one's prisoner anymore." Their hesitation was brief. A flicker of doubt she seized before turning back toward the house. The phone on the desk was blinking. She pressed play. Marco's voice filled the room, low and final. "If I don't come back, don't look for me. It's the only way to keep you alive." Helena's tears fell quietly. The truth weighed heavier than fear. He was heading toward a reckoning with his past, his enemies, maybe even with himself. And she knew she couldn't stay behind. Love might be dangerous, but some things fear can never kill. She took his coat from the chair, the same one that had once sheltered her from the rain, and walked out through the side door of the mansion. The city slept beneath a thin veil of rain. Her footsteps echoed softly, swallowed by the wind. Helena had no plan, only instinct. She followed the rhythm of her heart like someone chasing a memory that refused to fade. At every corner his name seemed to whisper from the walls. And deep down she knew this meeting would not be about rekindling love. It would be about confronting it. The past doesn't return just to punish. It returns to test what survived the pain. The cathedral clock struck midnight as Helena reached the abandoned docks. The rain fell in a steady rhythm, coating the pavement in silver reflections. Black cars were lined along the pier, engines humming low, their headlights flickering through the mist. Men stood in clusters beneath the dim glow of lamps, their voices muffled, their faces carved with tension. Cigarettes glowed like brief sparks of defiance against the darkness. And there between them was Marco, the man who had once stopped the rain to cover her. Only now his eyes carried the calm of someone ready to say goodbye. The air itself seemed to pause, as if the world were holding its breath again, just like on that first night. Helena hid behind a rusted container, her pulse drumming louder than the storm. The wind carried fragments of the conversation, names, threats, debts, words that cut like broken glass. Marco's voice was quiet but unyielding, the kind of calm that came from someone who had already made peace with his fate. One of the men stepped forward, the unmistakable authority in his tone. "You've lost yourself, Bellini." "All because of a woman." Marco didn't move, didn't blink. "She reminded me I'm still human." The answer landed like a confession, followed by the sharp metallic sound of a gun being cocked. Helena's body froze. The rain grew heavier, pooling around her feet, turning the dock into a mirror that reflected fear and lightning. Marco lifted his head slightly, as if sensing her presence somewhere in the shadows. And in that suspended moment, with the storm raging and fate closing in, she understood what their story had always been. That love born out of guilt never dies easily. It just waits for the next storm to return. Lightning tore the sky open, revealing faces twisted by betrayal. Marco stood alone, his coat soaked, his expression carved in stone. The men who surrounded him were once his brothers, men who had shared blood and loyalty. Now they aimed that same loyalty against him. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. His silence was stronger than their rage. He knew he wouldn't leave that place unscathed, but somewhere deep inside, he also knew he wasn't alone. Helena's heart pounded painfully in her chest as she watched from the dark. Every breath she took hurt. Every step Marco took shattered what little distance still separated them. The rain ran down her face, blending with tears she didn't want to admit were hers. "Don't go," she whispered into the storm, her voice stolen instantly by the wind. And then the first shot echoed. The sound ripped through the air like thunder made of iron. Chaos erupted, men shouting, guns firing, the smell of gunpowder thick and suffocating. Marco moved like instinct itself, unarmed but unafraid, hurling himself against one of the gunmen, dragging him into the mud. Helena ran. She didn't think. She didn't care. The storm roared around her, but all she could hear was his name pulsing in her mind. Marco. When she reached him, he was on his knees, his shoulder bleeding, the fabric of his shirt torn and darkened by rain and blood. His breath came shallow, but his eyes still burned. "Why did you come?" he asked, his voice breaking between pain and disbelief. Helena knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she pressed them to his wound. "Because you taught me not to run from the rain," she whispered. Their fingers met, warm despite the cold, and for an instant the world around them disappeared. Lightning flashed across his face, and in that flicker she saw something she had never seen before. Fear, not of dying but of losing her. Another man stepped from the shadows, raising his gun. Marco reacted on instinct, turning, placing himself in front of her. The gun fired once, a sound dry and final. Helena's scream tore through the rain, but it was swallowed by the storm. He fell forward, his body collapsing against her, his eyes still locked on hers. She held his face, her tears mixing with the rain. "No, this isn't how it ends," she whispered, desperate, shaking him as if she could pull him back through sheer will. Marco's lips curved into a faint, almost peaceful smile. His voice was barely audible, carried away by the storm. "Maybe," he murmured, "it's exactly how it begins." And as the rain poured down harder, washing the blood from the concrete, Helena held him in her arms, a woman cradling both her loss and her rebirth. The city slept unaware. The thunder rolled over the horizon, and the love that began in the rain ended the same way, not extinguished, only reborn in silence. The police arrived too late, their sirens echoing like distant grief. The men had already scattered, shadows dissolving into the storm. Helena dragged Marco's body beneath the cover of a warehouse, his weight too heavy for her to bear, but she didn't stop. "Stay with me, please," she whispered again and again, her voice trembling. He looked at her through rain-blurred eyes, still carrying that same calm she'd seen from the very first night. "You saw me when no one else did, Helena. That's enough." The sound of the rain swallowed everything, fear, pain, time itself. Helena pressed her hands to the wound, sobbing quietly. "You're not dying here. Not now." Marco's breath came ragged, his voice low and rough. "I promised you shelter. And I kept it, even if that shelter cost me hell." His hand found her face one last time. "You made me remember what it means to be human." Outside, thunder rolled. Every drop that fell between them felt like another goodbye. A sudden flash lit the sky, and the ground trembled. Fire began crawling across the floor, devouring the wooden crates stacked along the walls. Helena tried to lift him, but his grip caught her wrist. "Go," he said. "No," she cried. "Not without you." He looked at her, eyes burning brighter than the flames. "This isn't how we end, Helena. This is how we survive." And with what little strength he had left, he pushed her toward the door. She fell into the mud outside, screaming his name as the blaze swallowed the warehouse. The fire roared behind her, reflecting in the tears that cut through the ash on her skin. Marco's figure vanished into the inferno, his silhouette lost in the orange glow. The metallic collapse of the roof echoed like a final prayer. Helena curled forward, trembling beneath the heat and the rain, caught between the burn of loss and the chill of grief. The storm did not stop. It only tried, in vain, to wash away the impossible. By dawn, silence had settled over the ruins. Smoke drifted across the pier. The flames had died, leaving only blackened skeletons of metal and ash. Police officers picked through the wreckage. Firefighters sifted through what was left. Helena stood apart, her body streaked with soot, her eyes fixed on the ground. They never found a body, only a jacket, the same one that had once shielded her from the rain. Soaked, singed at the edges, but still whole enough to remember the man who wore it. She pressed the jacket to her chest and closed her eyes. It still smelled like him. Rain, smoke, and memory. "You saved me again," she murmured. The wind brushed past, carrying strands of her hair across her face. For a fleeting second she swore she heard him, that same calm, deep voice whispering, "You're safe now." And she knew, somehow, that he was still there, watching her, unseen as the rain itself. Time moved quietly after that. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. Helena walked the city again, but something in her remained suspended, like a thread still tied to what was lost. People whispered about the fire at the docks, the fall of a criminal empire. But to her, it was never a story of crime. It was a story of love and redemption, written in thunder and flame. One afternoon, as she crossed the bridge, she saw a man standing by the railing, tall, still, a dark suit against the grey skyline. For a heartbeat she forgot how to breathe. She took a step forward, then another, but he was gone, dissolved into the passing crowd. Helena smiled softly, her eyes glistening. "You were always good at that, showing up when it rains." And just then, a single drop fell. Gentle, deliberate, like a promise. The rain returned, and with it, the quiet truth she had always known. Love never dies. It only changes its shape, and waits for the next storm. The sky had darkened, and Milan breathed beneath the weight of the rain that washed its streets clean. Helena walked slowly, his coat draped over her shoulders, the cold wind brushing against her face. People ran for shelter, umbrellas opening like flowers in panic, but she didn't move. She stood still, letting the storm fall. Because now, the rain was no longer punishment. It was memory. It was promise. It was his voice, carried in the thunder, reminding her that some loves are eternal, even when they end. In the reflection of the puddles, she saw it all. The woman who once wept in the storm. The man who stopped his car. The moment fate pulled their lives together. The past returned, but without pain. Only the soft echo of something that had survived both guilt and time. Helena lifted her face toward the clouds and smiled. "You won, Marco," she whispered. And the lightning that cut through the sky at that exact moment seemed to answer her. The rain fell harder, washing the scars of the pier away, erasing footprints, blurring what was broken, but leaving behind what truly mattered, the love born from chaos. Helena understood then that redemption doesn't come from forgetting the past, but from accepting it. And there, beneath the same rain that had started everything, she finally realized that endings don't exist, only new beginnings. The hospital smelled of alcohol and shattered hope. The white lights flickered overhead like trapped lightning. Helena walked down the hallway, her steps soft but her heartbeat loud, steady, defiant. 3 days had passed since the fire at the docks, and no one believed he could have survived. But she did. Something deep in her chest pulled her there, as if fate wasn't done writing their story. When she entered the room, time slowed. Marco lay still, covered in bandages and wires, his skin pale as winter. The sound of the monitors filled the room, a fragile rhythm, the pulse of a life refusing to end. Helena approached carefully, her hands trembling, her eyes glistening with tears. She sat beside him and touched his hand, cold but alive. "You promised you wouldn't leave me in the rain again," she whispered. For a long moment there was only silence. Then, a movement, faint but real. His fingers curled around hers, weak yet deliberate. Helena gasped, the pain and relief colliding inside her like lightning in her chest. "Can you hear me?" she asked, voice breaking. Slowly his eyes opened, as if waking from a world beyond reach. That same look was still there, guilt, tenderness, and something only she could understand. "You should have run," he murmured, his voice hoarse, barely more than breath. "And leave you to die?" "Never," she said, her hand tightening around his. "You don't understand, Helena." Some people don't come back from what I've done. And some people, she whispered, her eyes soft, don't come back from a love like this. A small, fractured smile crossed his lips before his eyes closed again. Not in pain, but in quiet surrender. He found peace in the sound of her voice. The doctors called it a miracle, but Helena knew better. It wasn't a miracle, it was will. Marco had always fought the inevitable, and now he was fighting once more. At night, when the city outside was quiet, she talked to him, about the rain, about the books, about the heartbeat of Milan finding its rhythm again. He didn't answer. But sometimes, as she spoke, the monitor blinked. Steady, stubborn, alive, like a heart that refused to stop loving. In the quiet hours before dawn, the rhythm of the machines changed. The beeping that had become her lullaby stuttered, softer, uncertain. Helena opened her eyes just as Marco's did. He was awake, really awake. She froze, breath caught between disbelief and hope. "You came back," she whispered, tears falling before she could stop them. He looked at her, calm, almost serene. "I never left." His voice was weak, but the words carried weight. "You brought me back, Helena. You made me want to see the sun again." She didn't answer, only held his hand tighter, her fingers trembling between his. Sometimes love wasn't a cure. It was the will to keep breathing when everything else gave up. "Helena," he said, struggling for breath, "there's something I need to tell you." She wiped her face and nodded. "Anything." He took a deep breath, pain tightening the corners of his eyes. "That night, in the rain, I didn't stop by chance. I was running from a deal gone wrong, trying not to be found. And when I saw you, it was like the world forced me to stop. You were the only mistake destiny ever wanted me to make." Helena met his gaze, her heart aching with something that wasn't anger. It was too full of tenderness for that. "If it was a mistake," she whispered, "then I don't want to be right." He smiled faintly, exhaustion softening his features. "I thought I could protect you without destroying you. But no one gets close to me without scars." She shook her head, tears glistening in her lashes. "I regret nothing, Marco. You saved me twice from the rain and from myself." The silence that followed was deep, fragile. It wrapped around them like an invisible embrace. The monitor began to quicken, a warning hum. She gripped his hand harder, desperate. "Stay with me, please." He exhaled, slow and uneven. "If I could, Helena, I'd live it all again, just to find you one more time." His voice trembled, his gaze drifting between the ceiling and her face. "You reminded me that there's still light, even for those who've lived too long in the dark." Helena leaned forward until her forehead rested against his. She closed her eyes and felt his breath mingle with hers, faint, warm, alive. Outside, the rain had begun again, soft, steady, endless. Helena looked toward the window and smiled. "It's raining again, Marco. I think the sky wants you close." He smiled back, his voice barely a whisper. "Then promise me. When it rains, you'll think of me." She nodded, eyes shining. "And you'll think of the sun." For a moment, the air between them grew lighter, as if the pain itself had paused to listen. In that small, fragile instant, there was peace. The following days passed like slow waves. Recovery came inch by inch, a word, a step, a breath. Marco began to speak more, to walk with help, even to laugh. Helena was always near, steady as gravity, though her eyes betrayed the fear that this happiness was borrowed. Sometimes he read the books she brought to his bedside and laughed softly at their tragedies. "Life's not so different," he'd say. "1,000 wrong turns. But one of them makes it all worth it." One afternoon she found him standing by the window. The first sunlight in days filtered through the glass, painting gold across the sterile white walls. "You know what's strange?" he murmured. "Pain taught me more about love than anything else." Helena leaned her chin gently on his shoulder. "And what did love teach you?" He looked at her reflection in the glass, the ghost of a smile crossing his lips. "That sometimes You have to lose everything to finally understand what you were too afraid to feel. The calm of the hospital was deceptive. There was a kind of silence that warned of endings. Helena felt it. A heaviness in the air, a truth she didn't want to name. Marco was growing weaker, his eyes slower to open, his smile taking longer to find. "Are you still afraid?" she asked softly. He smiled faintly. "Not of dying, of leaving you." She squeezed his hand, tears pressing behind her eyes. "Then don't." He closed his eyes, the faintest sigh escaping his lips. "If love is redemption," he murmured, "then maybe this is how a life is paid for." The night moved slowly, wrapped in that fragile stillness that lives between exhaustion and peace. Helena dozed beside the bed, her head resting on her arm, while Marco watched her in silence. The dim light traced her face, calm, tired, beautiful. He thought of everything, the rain, the fire, the moments that had brought him back from himself. And in that stillness he understood something simple. Life doesn't need to be long, to be infinite. It only needs to be loved. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face with a tenderness that felt like a farewell to fear. For the first time he realized that peace was not the absence of pain, but the acceptance of it. When morning came, the room was filled with a quiet that didn't feel heavy. The monitor still blinked softly, its rhythm steady, calm. Helena woke to the gentle touch of his hand. "Good morning," she said, smiling through sleepy eyes. "Good morning," he replied, his voice weak but warm. He hesitated for a moment, eyes searching hers. "You know, there's something I never told you." She leaned closer. "What is it?" Marco exhaled slowly, the hint of a smile touching his lips. "I love you." The words came without grandeur or promise, only truth. Helena began to cry, but it was a peaceful kind of tears, the kind born not from pain, but from surrender. "I love you too, Marco. Since that night in the rain." He smiled faintly, his gaze soft, full of light. "Then it was worth it." The monitor kept its calm rhythm, steady and sure. Helena rested her head against his chest, listening to the slow, deliberate beat of his heart. It was the sound of redemption. By evening, the rain had stopped. The sun slipped through the hospital window, spilling gold across the bed. Helena stayed quiet, watching the light dance over his skin. Marco closed his eyes, his breath deep and steady. "When I'm gone," he murmured, "remember this. Love is what remains when the world ends." She kissed his forehead gently, whispering, "You'll still see me, Marco, in every drop that falls." For the first time, he slept without nightmares. The soft hum of the machines filled the room, in rhythm with the city outside learning to live again. Helena knew nothing would ever be the same, and maybe that was how it should be, because their love had never needed to last to be eternal. Some loves exist only in the space between the storm and the silence, and that's enough. Years passed, and his memory remained, not sharp, not haunting, but constant, like the quiet echo of rain on glass. Time didn't erase what the storm had written. It only softened the edges. Life continued its slow bloom after the tempest, fragile, stubborn, and still beautiful. Everything Marco had been now lived in the small, quiet things the world left behind. Helena now ran the old school where she once taught. Children's laughter filled the hallways, a sound so full of life it almost hurt. The walls had been repainted, the garden restored, the piano in the music room polished until it gleamed. The building had been reborn, and so had she. What no one knew was that much of the funding came from anonymous donations. Each letter signed with a single initial, M, on rainy days. She still closed her eyes and listened to the distant hum of a car engine. Sometimes she imagined he'd appear in the doorway again, wearing that dark coat, that quiet gaze that spoke more than words ever could. But when she opened her eyes, There were only trees swaying and rain pooling at her feet. And she smiled, because she knew he was there, not as a ghost, but as the proof that love, once real, never leaves. One morning, an envelope arrived at the school. Thick paper, a golden seal. Inside, a single sentence written in a hand she'd know anywhere. The good you spread is what keeps me alive. No name, no address, just that. Her heart fluttered and a soft laugh escaped her lips, not from disbelief, but from peace. The past hadn't returned to haunt her. It had returned to take care of her. That afternoon, the sky began to close once more. Dark clouds rolled in from the north, and the wind carried that same faint scent, rain and memory, the perfume of the night that had changed everything. Helena sat on the bench in the garden, watching the leaves swirl through the air like tiny fragments of time. The first drops fell, gentle, familiar. And there, between the laughter of children and the earthy smell of wet soil, she heard it. A deep, steady engine, one she could never mistake. A black limousine stopped at the gate. The driver stepped out, opened the rear door, and for a moment, time hesitated. A man emerged, older now, silver streaks in his hair, calm in his movements, composed in a way that only those who have faced their ghosts can be. Helena stood, her heart caught between dream and reality. For a second, the world became what it once was. The rain, the silence, and him. Marco Bellolini, in flesh and years, standing before her once more. They didn't rush toward each other. They simply stood there, eyes locked, as if recognizing home after a lifetime away. The rain darkened his suit, but he didn't care. He smiled, that same restrained smile she had carried in memory. "It's been a while, Helena," he said softly. "It's been a lifetime," she replied. The sound of rain was the same, but its weight was different now. It no longer hurt. It washed away everything that once did. He walked toward her slowly, every step heavy with years of unspoken promises. When he reached her, he took off his coat and laid it gently on the bench. "Still hate seeing you caught in the rain," he said with a faint smile. Helena laughed through tears. "I thought you'd forgotten. Some things we don't forget," he answered quietly. "We just learn to keep them safe." His tone was soft, reverent, more prayer than speech. She studied him in silence, tracing every new detail, the lines on his face, the grey in his beard, the peace that hadn't been there before. Marco looked different, changed by time and consequence. The power was still there, but softened now, tempered by forgiveness. "You've changed," she said. "So have you," he replied. "There's light in your eyes now." His voice carried a kind of farewell that didn't wound, a goodbye spoken with gratitude. They stayed there for a while, unhurried, as the rain fell in slow, even rhythms. The wind whispered through the trees, and the world seemed to pause just to listen. Marco looked toward the school building and smiled. "You made this a sanctuary." Helena shook her head. "No, I made it a home. You started it." He smiled gently. "No, Helena. The rain did. It always knew what it was doing." They both laughed, quiet, genuine, their laughter blending with the rain's soft applause. A distant thunder rolled across the sky, marking the end of something sacred. Marco looked at his watch, then back at her. "I have to go." Helena wanted to protest, to hold him there, but something in his eyes told her not to. "Where are you going?" she asked, voice trembling. He smiled, calm, certain. "Somewhere I've always wanted to be, somewhere peaceful." She took a step forward, her eyes wet. "And what about me?" He lifted his hand, touched her face gently, the same gesture that once stopped time itself. "You stay," he whispered, "to continue what we began." Their goodbye carried no drama, no despair. Only silence, a long tender silence that spoke of all the words they never had the chance to say. Helena rested her face against his chest, listening to the heart that still beat with quiet strength. "You were always my rain," she murmured. "And you," he answered softly, "were always my shelter." The words lingered between them as the world seemed to exhale. Marco stepped back, his smile gentle, almost eternal. Then, without another glance, he turned and entered the car. The door closed. The engine hummed. And as the limousine disappeared into the curtain of rain, Helena stood beneath the storm, her heart heavy, full, and finally free. The limousine drove away, its engine fading into the rhythm of the rain. Helena stood still, watching as the car disappeared around the corner. Then she looked at the bench. The coat was there, soaked through but neatly folded. She smiled. The gesture was the same as years ago. Life had come full circle, and now everything made sense. Love, after all, always finds its way back. The rain began to ease, and sunlight broke gently through the clouds. The garden shimmered, and the laughter of children returned in the distance. Helena picked up the coat and draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy yet comforting. She walked to the music room, opened the piano, and let her fingers glide across the keys. The melody was soft, filled with memory. Every note carried both farewell and promise. As she played, tears streamed down her face, but not from sadness. They felt like water cleansing her soul. She looked out the window at the silver sky and whispered, "You kept your word, Marco. You kept me safe." The piano's sound filled the air like a prayer. The wind swept through the room, stirring the curtains. And for a fleeting moment, Helena felt it. Someone was still watching her. The same protective silence as always. The day ended with the scent of wet earth and the glow of sunlight filtering through the school's stained glass. Life, at last, had found its balance again. Helena closed the piano, smiled into the quiet, and whispered, "Thank you for the rain." Outside, a final drop fell. Slow, solitary, like an answer. Their story hadn't ended. It had simply found the peace that true love deserves. Share your thoughts about this story and subscribe to hear more tales of intense romance. Power and redemption, where every tear hides the beginning of something new.